everybody. This is Jason Shattuck back again with another episode of Chasing Frets, and I'm here once again with my good buddy Joe Gore.
Hey, it's really exciting to be here, Jason, and I'm so stoked about our new podcast venture with Premier Guitar. This is going to be really cool.
And as you heard on Monday, the episode with Blake, he could be one of the most interesting guitar players in the world, and I think he's definitely up there. And today we're going to talk about kind of the other side of his musical personality as him as a producer. And this one kind of goes deep as to kind of his ethos as a producer and how he kind of, this is one line, Joe, you threw out when we were talking about him as a guest, is how he plays guitar with a producer's ear. And what were some of the things you heard in his playing that made you think of that idea?
Well, as I mentioned in the first episode, you know, I've known Blake since he was 19, and from the get-go, he just played with the weight and maturity of a much older, much more experienced musician. You know, leaving aside anything he can do technically, which is amazing, it's just he's thinking music, not necessarily guitar, and he brings that same sensibility to the records he produces too. They're very his Alabama Shakes record, for which he was nominated for Producer of the Year, you know, was a huge hit, but it's not terribly conventional. It's, you know, very original sound palette, doesn't sound like quite anything else. And the same with all the other production work that he's done. So he brings the same profundity and lack of trying to show off or prove anything to his productions as he does to his guitar work.
So this one will be a bit of a longer episode. We go pretty deep on this one. So please leave a review and a rating wherever you get your podcast. You can hit us up at chasingfrets@premierguitar.com if you want to shout out any questions or comments. And we hope you enjoy this episode, and we'll see you later this week. But Blake, welcome back.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So today we are going to, so before when Joe and I were kind of scheming of what we could talk to Blake Mills about, one of the lines that Joe was I think fell out, and I said, that's it. That's what we got to talk about, is playing guitar with a producer's ear. Because one of the things you're known for almost as much, if not more than your guitar playing, is your production. So first I wanted to ask you, when did, you know, as we talked in the previous episode, kind of we went over your kind of early years, and you know, it was really important to you to be able to join a rock band and travel the country. But when did the idea of production as an occupation and as something you might want to do seriously kind of enter your career and your thoughts?
I think it was a logical place to go after no longer being in a band, having done a couple years of session work. Well, let me backtrack for a second, because when you're in a band, you are, and you're making a record. You're in what we were in, like, this was like 2007. We were making our first full length.
Are you referring to Simon Dawes?
Yeah, this is a band called Simon Dawes, and you know, half of these guys are people that I grew up with in high school, and the fact is, like, you're embarking on a process after having listened to records your entire life and fantasized about the way that those records were made and why they sound the way that they sound. And so you're applying this, some of it's based on reading and some of it's just based on assumption. And you're applying all of that, like, knowledge and, you know, and fake news to the process. That's, you're producing. You know, the artist is always imparting some aspect of themselves onto the sound of the record. A lot of people outside of record making, and even some on the inside, associate production just with the sound of a record, you know, the style of it, and that's not always where the hand of production is really at play.
Can you explain?
For example, you could have, let's say you have a solo artist who comes in to a record making process, and they've signed on to work with a producer because they like the way that the records that person has produced in the past sound, and the style, and the quality of those records. So let's say that the nature of this artist is such that they write songs on guitar, and they've got lyrics and melody, and they write them by themselves, and they come in and they go, this is how it goes. I don't really know how to treat this song, how to, what the drums should do, what the bass should do. So a lot of that ends up falling on the producer and musicians that the producers worked with. And that record can result in sounding a lot like records that producer has made before, because he's presumably is working with musicians that have played on other people's records. And there's sort of there's a history to that whole process, which is like, I've selected you because I like the way these other records sound, and I identify with those records. But the other way it can go is that somebody comes in, let's say you're working with a band, all of a sudden the nature of how these songs are performed and articulated is somewhat predetermined. The style of the way these songs are going to sound, it emanates from the sound of this band that already exists. You're not putting a band together of studio musicians. This is it's a whole other entity. So the role of a producer in that project is already completely different than it was on the last record they worked on, where it was just with one musician, and so the rules change every time. The job description changes with every single record, and I think that there's something very natural about that coming from a position of being a studio musician, because the style of music, the temperament of the artist, your band, everything changes each time as well for the studio musician. And they have to rely on their own sensibilities. They have to rely on their musical sensibilities. They have to rely on their ability to communicate and interpret things from other people and try to be agreeable in those environments with those other people. Those two things were anathema to being in a band as a teenager, meaning that when you're in a band, especially if you're a co-writer, you're in a band, you're protecting your own artistic personality and your own creative decisions from the personality and decisions of the other members in the band, so as to get your creativity across. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's the opposite of being hired for something.
How so?
Well, if you're in a band and you're kind of like, you're staking your flag next to these three other flags, and you're not trying to take their flags down, but you're making sure that hopefully everybody at the end of this thing gets a chance to see your flag. You know what I mean? And hear your flag and hear your mark that you're leaving on this music. This is the band that you're in. And especially if you're not the lead singer, you get real protective over, how you think it should go. You start suggesting things that the bass line could do. I'm like, well, what if the drums, this is when you're recording, right? Or rehearsing. What if the drums do this? And, well, what if the drums do that? That doesn't sound very good. Let's try that. And I can't imagine how annoying it would have been to be in a band with me at that age. Because you're micromanaging and you're producing, and ultimately, I think that's what drove a wedge between me and my friends in that band is that I had all of these things that I wanted to try and wanted to hear when we were in the studio, but it was uncomfortable because I was taking up so much air in the room. But then when you're the producer on a project, as opposed to being just a band member or a guitar player, I mean, I don't mean to say just, but when you're in a producerial role on a project, it's both easier to not step in at every turn with the idea you have in your head that you want to hear, or what the drums could do, what the bass could do. It's easier to just sit back and see what happens. And at the same time, when you do make a suggestion, because you're not in the band, it's heard by everybody in the room in a completely different way. It's a different role. And I had the experience from being a session player of being able to communicate directly with producers about certain ideas that I had that felt like maybe if I were to just voice them, it might be overstepping a little bit. Like if something sounded a little off to me about what we were doing as a band, and I wanted us to maybe try one more take and see if we beat the thing that everybody was already happy with, if we just tweak this one little thing, you know who to go to in the room. You go to the producer. It's like this intermediary, it's the couple's therapist.
If you're lucky.
Yeah. So all those things really drew me to that role, those aspects of it.
Do you just enjoy being in control?
You're not always in control. In fact, it's just as much a comfortability with being in control, with taking control when you need to, like when the thing is not being steered. The artist is in control, but sometimes in order for the artist to be the artist, they can't spend psychic energy on things like, well, who are we going to get to tune the piano? When should we tune the piano if we're going to when should we record the piano song if we're here for a week, and the studio rate is such and such. Do we have it in the budget to pay for the piano tuner? Is everybody hungry? Should we order food? These are all things that are non-creative decisions that need to be made over the course of a day or a record. And it's control. And those are things that I just don't think help a record to have fall on the shoulders of an artist. And it's part of production, making sure the thing gets made.
Is it possible to ask how that sensibility that you've described really well affects some of your choices as a guitarist? And I ask because you had a very atypical career path. A, because you were really good, and B, because of proximity and access to a lot of talented people. And you got a leg up in recording and producing and seeing how studio works at a very, very young age. It's more typical for most of us to play for many, many years and then maybe get a chance to go in and record for the first time. And when you have a guitarist with some degree of technical skill, but no degree of any experience recording or making records, obviously you can come in with a lot of wrong-headed ideas and energy. Just from your experienced producer's perspective, is there any thoughts you might share with a guitarist who's more in that situation? Lots of experience playing, maybe not very much recording and producing.
Yeah, the thing that I think translates most directly from being in a position of playing guitar in an ensemble to production would be as an ensemble player, listening to what is there and what's not there, what's already happening, what somebody else is doing, and all the while thinking, now is what I'm about to do going to compound and like combine with all these things and make it worse or make it better? Like, is there anything I can do that would enhance what else is going on here? I had this thought the other day when I was doing a solo, like live stream solo thing. Now we're in shelter in place. We very quickly as a musical society have adapted to solo performing in front of an iPhone camera and broadcasting it to the world. And it's terrifying, and it's very different from live performance. And it's very different from anything I'm used to in terms of playing for an audience.
Well, how's it? Why is it different from a television date or
Well,
going to the festival and opening for an audience 10 times what you're used to?
for me, the biggest difference is you're completely cut off from the reception, like what environment people are receiving the sound in. I mean, it's one thing to have a barrier between the live sound coming through a PA to the audience, and then you're on stage and you got your monitor mix, and there's still a sense of what's going on out there. There's still a sense of the environment in which you're playing, and there's an audience, and you can avert your attention or your gaze over here, and then over here, and then over here, and it's there's an organism that you're interacting with, whether you're choosing to or not. Even if you just had your head down the entire time, you're still interacting in a room with sound and the other people in that room, in their presence. When you're at home, like, it's such a vacuum. It's such a vacuum. The only interaction you have is the comments, which are like delayed, and it's the last thing you want to be reading or looking at when you're performing. It's like,
I was going to say, do you, for those venturing into quarantine podcasting, better to read the comments or better to skip your eyes?
Never ever read the comments for one. Yeah. But if you do, and you're trying to play at the same time, it's like an immediate way to turn your brain, set it to the noodling setting, where you're just mindlessly, you're no longer in any sort of zone. It's just like you just can't. But going back to like solo performing in general, maybe even with an audience in place, you have a responsibility to introduce something to the room. It's like starting a conversation. To me, that idea is really makes me very anxious. The idea of responding to somebody else's thought, whether it be conversational or musical, is really easy to wrap my head around, because I'll either have something to add to it, or a response, or I won't. And I'm perfectly comfortable with not having a response and not participating in a conversation, and just listening or asking a question of somebody, like, that's a fine place to be. So translate that musically, right? So you're playing in a band and you're listening to what people are doing, and you're not necessarily sure what you could be doing that would add and not step on somebody else's toes. Like, not playing is a decision. It has a sound, and everybody else who's listening in the audience or listening to that record is digesting this thing with the decision of not playing, in that space. And there's so many times I've listened back and wish that I had chosen not to play, the thing that I was doing. There's a sound to playing when you're trying to find the thing that works. You know what I mean? That kind of like searching sound where it sort of stutters, and you like take a step over here and oh no, that's not right, and you kind of come back and you retreat. Or there's something wonderful about listening to certain people try to find the thing to play, and get there, and then you realize that what they land on is the result of a thought process. I mean, there's a whole conversation happening when you're listening to a record, and you're communing with somebody who could have been dead for 150 years. That's fascinating. That's one of the magical things about listening to music and playing it at the same time. So that is very similar to production, where you're trying to play guitar like a producer. You're listening as a producer to, you might be listening to a song that somebody is playing, and you're imagining what the drums and bass could be doing, or you're imagining what the guitar would be doing, and then therefore what the drums and bass could be doing in response to that. Or you're listening to the studio musicians or the band on the recording date playing and thinking, are all the pieces of the puzzle here? Do we even need anything else? Do we need another part in there? Is there a chunk of the the kind of the shape of this thing missing? And can that somehow be played on guitar? You know, that's where my head goes, is like, can I get, there's a percussive part missing, but can I just maybe get away with doing it on guitar somehow without it sounding like there's another guitar in there? Last week we talked about the Allman Brothers band a lot, because we were talking about slide, and there's a great example of, well, in the Allman Brothers and in some Southern rock bands in the 70s, it's like you've got 4 guitars, 3 guitars, sometimes, you know, in these ensembles, and it's just piling on the pain sometimes, you know, and I grew up in a lot of musical settings where we were just playing Southern rock. We were playing our version of that music and jamming, and I never wanted to be making music that was like embarrassing to be playing, you know what I mean? Or the idea that somebody's listening to it going like, oh, these guys are just, you know, it's a circle jerk, you know? Yeah. So, and I was also around guitar players who I thought were incredible. You know, Dwayne Betts, I looked up to. He was one of my favorite guitar players, you know? And so, there was this kind of like trading of solos going around all the time that you do when you're jamming. It's like, okay, now it's your turn. Oh, now it's my turn. Okay, now it's his turn. And I had just as much fun listening to the other people playing as I did stepping up and taking a solo. And I never wanted to be stepping on or distract somebody with what I was doing when it was time for them to be, you know, doing their thing. Like I was listening. I would forget to play sometimes. It's because you're listening. And there's probably a reason for that.
Turning back to something you said a couple minutes ago in passing, you talked about, we were joking about reading the comments when you're doing a live webcast.
Mm-hmm.
And you said about, well, that just makes you, it takes you out of the moment and you just start, you know, noodling. As 2 longtime guitar magazine editors who listen to a lot of guitar players and a lot of guitar music, that revelation never comes for many, many players. You know, you just mentioned it as if it were second nature. But, you know, for so many, they're just locked in the world of what they can display and what they can do, and get caught in a mental trap of listening to themselves, judging, criticizing, feeling proud, whatever, but it's not a genuine connection to the music that's being created around you. And I think that was one thing that impressed me most about you as a teenage player, is you had just gotten over that crap. It wasn't even a topic. It's just, you know, you would play something true and profound. And man, such a huge percentage of guitarists never even glimpse that revelation.
Well, guitar is an embarrassing instrument. Look at our history. It's a relatively young instrument, and like, look at our heroes, and like, compare that to compare that to the heroes of piano or violin or sitar, and how deep that lineage goes. Singers, I mean, it's communion with
a spiritual world that may or may not exist. It with drums, even, it's communicating, a means of communication through oppression, and outlawing singing, and it's so deep culturally what music means and has meant to people. And in my 20s, I think I looked at this thing that felt like my instrument, or like what I grew up with, and the guys that you associate with the instrument, and it's like big hair, spandex, makeup, and volume, and like, look at me, look at me, look at me. And it's sort of embarrassing. It's like, there are a lot of asshole personalities that seem to define guitar culture, and I just don't connect with that. I'm like kind of repulsed by it, and that's like half of it. The other half is, and I'd be curious to know what you guys think about this, but like, do musicians feel the need to cram everything that they feel like they are capable of doing? And I myself included in this. It's just that I think the things that I'm trying to cram in there are not the same, are not as familiar, right? Or like, there are things that I'll come across and be like, oh, I got to remember to do that. That's really cool. That's really interesting, or really outside the box. But I mean, it's this, I do the same thing that everybody else is doing, which is like, I want to display what I feel like I can do, and what I want to communicate. But do you think musicians feel the need to cram that in at every opportunity because we assume that audiences are more impatient now, or just impatient in general, that like, if I don't throw this in there, then people will never know that I can do it, and I won't get another chance to do it because they'll pass me by, like they're in competition with somebody else, some other like imaginary musician that they're in competition with for their job, for their gig. I think at an early age, somebody might have told me, maybe it didn't even have anything to do with music. Maybe I read it somewhere, but like that idea that like nobody in the world is as good at being you as you are naturally, and I thought that was a really interesting thing, musically speaking, because we as musicians we spend a lot of time thinking about what other musicians would do in our position, and I think that's a human thing. I mean, I bet that's like, that's a big part of the thought process and problem solving. What would somebody else do here, right? And that probably goes hand in hand with some of my favorite things I've ever been a part of have resulted in feeling like they're bigger than me, bigger than the people, bigger than the sum was greater than the parts. You know what I mean? So it's an approach. It's like an ethos that I think a lot of musicians I like to work with and be around. I think we all do that. We all that's part of the scientific method. For us.
Yes, but you cop to sometimes being victim of that. Cram everything you know into where it ought not be cramped. But as I would offer as contradictory evidence, your new album, Mutable Set, where you have command of a vast range of styles and a vast range of sounds, but you restricted yourself to a fairly narrow slice of sound world for that record, and as a result, created something that has great unity. It's its own sound world, unlike any other record, and for me, that's one of the key definitions of what makes a great record. So I would beg to differ. I would say you're actually pretty darn good at not bringing too much to the party every time.
But that thing we were talking about a minute ago about the sound of not playing, that the absence of another part is not necessarily less information. That it's there because there's something else going on, that the addition of another part would do a disservice to, for this record, for Mutable Set, the process that made it different than the other records, solo records of mine that I've done, was that I one of the things that was different is that I started this one on tape and on analog tape, and I feel like analog tape compresses in such a way where the more you add to it, the worse things start to sound. Like if they sounded really good to begin with, you got a really good big sound on a vocal or a guitar or a piano with a lot of air around it, and it's close and it's got a lot of information. There's less bandwidth to play with, I think, on tape, to where you can keep adding other big sounds and that the guitar still sounds as good as it did. I mean, even if you can think of your favorite guitar sounds on your favorite records, and that you hear them and they come in, and then the vocal comes in, and well, I guess what I'm saying is go back to those records and pay attention to what happens to the guitar sound when the vocal comes in. Yeah, like the addition of something else that deserves attention takes away from the other thing that already that had all that room to play with. So like in other words, on this record, I spent more time trying to get something out of the performance of the foundation, the guitar and the vocal, or piano and vocal, and then once I got a performance that I was happy with, the things that I was happy with about it were a collection of moments, and any other idea or any other little thing that I'm hearing or somebody else is hearing, it's this process of guess and check, where you put it on and you listen back, and it could be a great part. It could be incredibly played. It could be an incredible sound, but you now have this knowledge of what was there before, and if something's being covered up, and if it's worth it to keep the new part, to keep the overdub. I think that process is what resulted in large part to how sparse the record sounds. But Joe, this is still a form of cramming everything into it's decision making. It was not a that's great just as it is, let's move on.
I guess you're saying it's informed by everything you know.
Yeah.
And the whole pool of what you know informs the decisions you make when creating it. But that wealth of knowledge need not be on display every single time your finger hits a string.
But I'm saying it is on display. I'm saying
it's not, man.
No,
it's a
check
very
it out.
minimal record.
No, check it out. Like it. Okay, the to say that the wealth of knowledge is not on display would negate the fact that the record sounding the way that it does is a direct result of the things learned from hearing records that don't sound like that. Right?
Yeah, you're right. I just think I just have so much animus.
But I want to give more, if I can. I want to give more people that confidence to know that, like, that sound, the thing that we associate with holding, is powerful. Not to everybody. A lot of people will hear my record, and a lot of people will hear other musicians who are reserved and probably think, well, what's the big deal? And you have to be willing to be totally okay with that. But that, in truth, there's a lot of power to the things that we're talking about, because if somebody is receptive to it, it communicates something that nothing else can. Nothing else played can the great actors of all time are the ones who say something with a gesture, and that's something I think everybody understands immedately.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, also, I apologize for arguing with the artist.
No, well, you're not wrong. It's just I hope that I hope that the definition of like what is impressive, especially in the guitar world, but culturally, I hope that we can continue to have conversations as musicians who are aware of the power of restraint. All of us here, like, I hope we can have conversations that help articulate things that I think a lot of people are feeling, but maybe don't have the confidence always to entertain, because they think, like, I don't know that people are going to get it. I don't know if this is too basic. I don't know if I should.
Well, I think we should explain for listeners who haven't had the chance to check out Blake's new album, Mutable Set, just a few words about what it is and isn't. It's a singer-songwriter album, and Blake's songwriting, or co-songwriting, I guess you worked with the lyricist, is very much on display. But man, is it an unconventional palette. There's a lot of guitar, a lot of keyboards. There's a great deal of ambiguity about who's playing what a lot of the time. There's only snippets of bass and drums, though the ones that are there are very dramatic. There's one song where it's as if the drums are threatening to come in, but really never play more than a tap or two. There's a lot of very watery, sustained,
really good
sine
reverbs,
wave sort of sounds.
Really good reverbs.
I don't know. Some of those I don't know whether they're keyboards or your guitars, and then a lot of kind of watery. Reminds me of Van Dyke Park's kind of watery diatonic dissonance, where kind of just a lot of interesting white key dissonance, and it's really its own sound world, and the principal guitar voice is a rather small, humble, acoustic guitar sound. Basically, I mean, it's just the farthest thing you could imagine from a guitar stud album.
Yeah, I've always wondered why people still expect like every record I've ever put out with songs that I've written has had that same like what's a surprising lack of guitar, but what's the precedent? It's I don't even know if on other people's records I've ever played guitar in such a way that reminds me of that's just as overt. I guess there's got to be examples there, but
Well, I mean, I know you can. When I met you when you were still 19, we were goofing around with the Steve Vai solo from Crossroads. And
Yeah.
I mean, you do know all that stuff.
I do, but
don't go there.
I haven't done it in so long that I don't know if I could still do it. I mean, I like to think that like, but if I ever need it, in an emergency, I could pull it out. But I probably can't anymore.
I would love a quick interpretation of envisioning an emergency situation where you need to pull out the licks from Crossroads.
Okay, so
paint me a picture of the emergency situation when that would be needed.
Well, I don't know if it'd be like the licks from Crossroads, but there are situations where the music reaches a feverish intensity.
A more live situation than studio, probably.
I mean, unfortunately, but situations where what speed, speed and clarity, and intensity communicate something that can't be replaced or better articulated, or it's like that is the tone.
Dig
you
it.
know what I mean? Like a kind of Charlie Parker, or Pharoah Sanders, or something that like just the wailing. Wailing is not as bad a word when you think of other instruments as it is on guitar. But
why? It's so true, but why?
Because I think the tone that
it has to do with breath, I would think. Like
breath and the tones that are associated with, or that are like really complementary or hide a lot, like supportive to wailing guitar, are these like overly compressed, thin, distorted tones. They hide any kind of lack of technique, or like a bum note or whatever. The distance between the sound of a botched note or misfretted note or misplayed note and one that's played clearly with like that kind of hyper compression is really small. It's really narrow comparative to like a clean uncompressed guitar tone, where there's dynamic. So it's just like it's a crutch. And people who spend a lot of time trying to play fast or playing fast and succeeding, I think they oftentimes do it with that tone, and that tone is just so lifeless now. And there are examples of it on sax. There's sax playing and tone that you're just like, yeah, that's sax, and I'm not really here for it.
But then you hear Pharrell on like Coltrane Live in Seattle, and you're like,
that sounds more like an abandoned child than a saxophone. And that's the thing that can be communicated by speed and volume and intensity that can't. That's when it's appropriate to have the vocabulary that's used in that in the Crossroads vernacular.
Well, my hot take is, and I'm going to wrap up today's episode with this, is I feel Steve Vai won that duel. I felt that when I first saw it. The several times I've interviewed Steve, I've been meaning to tell him I think he got ripped off in the duel, but that was my hot take when I was 12.
Well, because they overdubbed the second guitar on that last A chord.
Right. So
that's cheating.
But wait a minute, Steve Vai is playing the thing that Ralph Macchio.
Yeah. We're talking metaphorical.
So he beat himself. The moral of the story is like, try as you might, the devil always wins.
There you go. That's a great way to wrap up today's episode.
Words to live by.
Blake, thanks for going super deep on this episode about the new record and your production. And looking forward, we're going to come back later this week with one more episode with Blake. where we're going to talk about his kind of the nuts and bolts of fingerstyle guitar and his approach to altered tunings. So tune in later this week for Chasing Frets. For Joe Gore and Blake Mills, I'm Jason Shadrick, and we'll see you soon.